On an ordinary morning, as everything seemed to be going smoothly, a desperate bark from a small dog pierced the calm. This wasn't just any bark. The dog was asking for help from a bus driver, causing him to stop in the middle of his route. But what was really happening? Before continuing the story, tell me which city you're watching from. I want to know how far this video has come. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so I can send you exciting stories like this every day. The bus was about to depart when a desperate bark cut through the morning air. Passengers turned startled to see a small Jack Russell Terrier frantically jumping beside the vehicle, its eyes filled with an almost human urgency. Driver Tom Harris hesitated, his finger hovering over the button to close the doors. Something in the dog's behavior made his heart clench. This wasn't a simple request for a ride. Little did he know that his decision in the next few seconds would trigger a series of events that would leave everyone in panic and reveal a moving truth about the bond between humans and their faithful companions. Tom's weathered hand trembled slightly as he pulled it away from the door control. In his 15 years as a bus driver in downtown Liverpool, he'd seen his fair share of odd occurrences, but this was something entirely new. The dog's bark came again, more insistent this time, its small body quivering with what Tom could only describe as desperation. "Oi, what's the holdup?" A man in a crisp business suit called from the back, his Scouse accent thick with impatience. Tom ignored him, his eyes fixed on the dog. Its collar jingled with each frantic leap, the tags catching the weak English sunlight filtering through the overcast sky. The terrier ran a few steps away from the bus, then looked back at Tom, clearly wanting him to follow. "I can't leave the bus, little fella," Tom called out, glancing at his watch. He was already running behind schedule, and his supervisor had been on his case lately about tardiness. But something tugged at him, a feeling he couldn't quite shake. The murmur of confusion among the passengers grew louder. Some craned their necks to see what was happening, while others huffed impatiently, eager to reach their destinations. "What in blazes is going on up there?" An elderly woman with a floral headscarf demanded, her voice cutting through the growing din. Tom took a deep breath, making a decision that he knew might cost him his job. "Ladies and gentlemen, I need to check on something. Please bear with me for a moment." Ignoring the chorus of groans and protests, Tom grabbed the first aid kit from under his seat and stepped out of the bus. The dog immediately ran towards him, circling his legs once before darting down the street. As Tom jogged after the dog, his mind raced. What was he doing? Following a strange dog and abandoning his bus. But something in the animal's behavior spoke of an intelligence and purposefulness that he couldn't ignore. The terrier led him about 50 yards down the street to a small alley between a chip shop and a newsagent's. There, partially hidden by a stack of cardboard boxes, lay a crumpled figure. "Oh, bloody hell," Tom muttered, his heart rate spiking. As he approached, he saw it was an elderly woman, probably in her 70s, lying face down on the cold concrete. Her silver hair was neatly pinned back, contrasting sharply with the vibrant blues and purples of her floral dress. The dog whined softly, nudging the woman's hand with its nose. Tom knelt beside her, gently placing 2 fingers on her neck to check for a pulse. To his relief, he felt a faint but steady beat. "Ma'am," he called, carefully rolling her onto her side. "Can you hear me?" The woman's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and confused. "Zeus," she murmured weakly. The dog, Biscuit Tom assumed, let out a soft yip in response, tail wagging slightly. Tom marveled at the animal's loyalty and quick thinking. Jack Russell Terriers were known for their intelligence and strong bonds with their owners. But this was extraordinary. "It's okay, ma'am," Tom reassured her, though his own heart was pounding. "Help is on the way." He turned to see a small crowd had gathered at the mouth of the alley. "Someone call an ambulance now." As a young woman in a Liverpool FC jersey dialed 9999, Tom noticed a medical alert bracelet on the elderly woman's wrist. Squinting to read the engraving, he saw it said, "Helen Thompson, diabetes." Suddenly the pieces clicked into place. Tom had attended a first aid refresher course just last month, and they'd covered diabetic emergencies. Could this be what he was dealing with now? "Mrs. Thompson," Tom said clearly, leaning close. "Are you diabetic? Do you need sugar?" Helen's eyes seemed to clear slightly at the question. She nodded weakly. Tom turned to the crowd. Does anyone have any sweets or a sugary drink? Quickly, as people rummaged through bags and pockets, Tom marveled at Zeus, who sat vigilantly by Helen's side. Somehow this clever animal had not only recognized its owner was in trouble, but had the presence of mind to seek help from a bus, of all things. A teenager with bright blue hair pushed forward, holding out a can of Irn-Bru. "Will this do?" Tom nodded gratefully, taking the drink. He popped the tab and gently lifted Helen's head, helping her take small sips. As they waited for the ambulance, the tension in the alley was palpable. Onlookers whispered and pointed, some offering assistance, while others simply gawked. Through it all, Zeus remained steadfast, his eyes never leaving Helen's face. Tom found himself wondering about the bond between this woman and her dog. How long had they been together? What kind of life did they share that would inspire such loyalty and quick thinking in a moment of crisis? As the wail of sirens grew closer, Tom glanced back towards his abandoned bus. He knew he'd have a lot of explaining to do to his supervisor, and probably a bus full of angry passengers to deal with. But looking at Helen's frail form and the devoted little dog by her side, he knew he'd made the right choice. The paramedics arrived in a flurry of activity, their efficient movements a stark contrast to the tense stillness of the waiting crowd. As they began to assess Helen, Tom found himself holding Zeus, who whined softly in his arms. "Don't worry, little guy," Tom murmured, scratching behind the dog's ears. "Your mum's in good hands now, thanks to you." As the paramedics prepared to load Helen into the ambulance, one of them turned to Tom with a grave expression. "It's a good thing you found her when you did," he said. "Another half hour, and—" He left the unfinished, but Tom understood the implication. The realization hit Tom like a punch to the gut. This little dog hadn't just been seeking help, he'd quite possibly saved his owner's life. As Helen was carefully placed on a stretcher, her eyes found Zeus, and a weak smile crossed her face. "My hero," she whispered, reaching out a trembling hand to her faithful companion. Tom felt a lump form in his throat as he watched the scene unfold. He'd always considered himself a cat person, but this experience was making him reconsider. The depth of the bond between Helen and Zeus was undeniable, a testament to the profound connections that could form between humans and animals. As the ambulance doors closed and the vehicle pulled away, its sirens cutting through the morning air, Tom stood in the alley with Zeus in his arms, surrounded by the dispersing crowd. The weight of what had just transpired settled over him, leaving him both exhilarated and deeply moved. What would happen next? How would this unexpected detour change the lives of everyone involved? And what would become of Zeus while Helen was in the hospital? As these questions swirled in Tom's mind, he knew one thing for certain. His view of the world and of the extraordinary capacities of our four-legged friends would never be the same again. The wail of the ambulance faded into the distance, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Tom stood in the alley, Zeus cradled in his arms as the gravity of the situation settled over him. The small dog whined softly, his eyes fixed on the spot where the ambulance had been. "It's all right, little fella," Tom murmured, stroking Zeus's head. "She'll be okay." He wasn't sure if he was reassuring the dog or himself. A throat cleared behind him, jolting Tom back to reality. He turned to find a police constable standing at the mouth of the alley, notepad in hand. "Excuse me, sir," the officer said, his Liverpudlian accent thick. "I need to ask you a few questions about what happened here." Tom nodded, suddenly aware of the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. As he recounted the events to the officer, he couldn't help but marvel at the series of coincidences that had led to this moment. If he hadn't been running late, if he hadn't decided to open the bus door, if Zeus hadn't been so persistent. "And you say the dog led you here?" the constable asked, eyebrow raised in skepticism. "That's right," Tom replied, feeling a surge of defensiveness on Zeus's behalf. "I know it sounds barmy, but it's the truth. This little guy knew exactly what he was doing." The officer jotted something in his notebook, then glanced at Zeus. "Well, I've heard stranger things. Jack Russells are known for their intelligence. Did you know they were originally bred for fox hunting? They're tenacious little buggers with a strong prey drive." Tom blinked in surprise. He hadn't known that, but it certainly explained Zeus's determination. So he was just following his instincts then? The constable shrugged. Maybe he's just a very good boy who loves his owner. Speaking of which, we'll need to find someone to look after him while Mrs. Thompson is in hospital. The thought hadn't occurred to Tom, and he felt a pang of worry. Doesn't she have any family? We're looking into it, the officer replied. In the meantime, we'll have to take him to a shelter. No, Tom interrupted, surprising himself with the vehemence in his voice. I mean, I could take him, just until Mrs. Thompson is back on her feet. The words were out of his mouth before he could think them through. Tom, who had never owned a pet in his life, who could barely keep his houseplants alive, was volunteering to care for a dog he'd met less than an hour ago. The constable raised an eyebrow. Are you sure about that, sir? It's a big responsibility. Tom looked down at Zeus, who gazed back at him with those soulful brown eyes. In that moment, he felt a connection to the little dog that he couldn't quite explain. I'm sure, he said firmly. As the officer took down Tom's details, a commotion at the end of the alley caught their attention. A group of angry passengers from the abandoned bus had found their way to the scene, led by the man in the business suit who had complained earlier. There he is, the man shouted, pointing an accusing finger at Tom, the irresponsible driver who left us stranded. Tom's heart sank. In the drama of the rescue, he'd completely forgotten about his job. He could already imagine the stern lecture from his supervisor, the write-up in his file, possibly even dismissal. How would he explain this? But as the irate passengers approached, something unexpected happened. Zeus, sensing the threat to his new friend, let out a series of sharp warning barks. The small dog's fierce protectiveness seemed to take everyone by surprise, momentarily halting the angry mob. In that pause, a young woman from the crowd stepped forward. Tom recognized her as the one who had called the ambulance earlier. Wait, she said, her voice cutting through the tension. You don't understand. This man is a hero. As she explained what had transpired, Tom watched the anger on the passengers' faces slowly transform into a mix of surprise and grudging admiration. The businessman who had led the charge looked particularly chagrined. I had no idea, he muttered, his earlier bravado deflated. I thought you just abandoned your post for no reason. Tom shook his head. I know how it must have looked. I'm sorry for the inconvenience. Truly. I couldn't ignore a cry for help, even if it came from an unexpected source. He glanced down at Zeus, who had calmed and was now sitting quietly at his feet. The constable, who had been watching the exchange with interest, cleared his throat. Right then, I think we're done here for now, Mr. Harris. We'll be in touch if we need any further information. As the crowd dispersed and the officer left, Tom found himself alone once more with Zeus. The events of the morning felt surreal, like a vivid dream, but the warm weight of the dog leaning against his leg was undeniably real. Well, mate, Tom said, looking down at his new charge. Looks like it's you and me for a while. What do you say we head home? Zeus's tail wagged in response, and Tom couldn't help but smile. As they walked out of the alley together, he realized that his life had irrevocably changed in ways he couldn't yet fathom. The bus depot was only a few blocks away, and Tom decided to face the music sooner rather than later. As they approached the imposing brick building, he felt Zeus tense beside him. It's all right, Tom murmured, more to himself than the dog. We're in this together now. Inside the depot was a hive of activity, drivers coming and going, the air filled with the smell of diesel and the chatter of workers changing shifts. Tom made his way to the supervisor's office, his heart pounding. He knocked on the door. Zeus, a reassuring presence at his side. Come in, a gruff voice called. Tom entered, finding his supervisor, Mr. Clarkson, scowling at a computer screen. The older man looked up, his frown deepening at the sight of Tom. Harris, he growled. I've got half the city complaining about a bus left abandoned on Girard Street. You'd better have one hell of an explanation. Tom took a deep breath and began to recount the morning's events. As he spoke, he watched Mr. Clarkson's expression shift from anger to disbelief to something approaching wonder. So let me get this straight, Mr. Clarkson said when Tom had finished. You left your bus to follow a dog who led you to a woman having a medical emergency. Put like that, it did sound rather unbelievable. Tom nodded, bracing himself for the inevitable reprimand. Instead, Mr. Clarkson let out a low whistle. Well, I'll be damned. Harris, in all my years in this job, I've never heard a story quite like that. He leaned back in his chair, studying Tom with new eyes. You know, we've been looking for someone to feature in our new community outreach campaign, Liverpool's finest, more than just drivers. I think we might have found our man. Tom blinked, taken aback by this unexpected turn. Sir? Mr. Clarkson smiled, a rare sight that transformed his craggy face. What you did today, Harris, that's the kind of thing that restores people's faith in humanity. It's exactly the image we want to project. As the implications of this sank in, Tom felt a wave of relief wash over him. Not only was he not being fired, but he was being celebrated. Mr. Clarkson's eyes fell on Zeus, who had been sitting quietly by Tom's side. And who's this little hero? This is Zeus, sir, Tom replied, reaching down to scratch behind the dog's ears. I've sort of agreed to look after him while his owner recovers. Mr. Clarkson nodded approvingly. Good man. Now why don't you take the rest of the day off? Get this little fella settled in. We'll sort out the details of the campaign tomorrow. As Tom left the office, his head spinning from the unexpected turn of events, he felt a newfound spring in his step. He looked down at Zeus, who gazed up at him with what Tom could have sworn was a look of pride. Well, mate, Tom said, grinning. Looks like we both might be local celebrities soon. What do you say we go home and celebrate with some proper dog food for you? Zeus's enthusiastic bark echoed through the depot, drawing smiles from the other drivers. As they walked out into the Liverpool afternoon, the weak sun breaking through the clouds, Tom realized that sometimes the most extraordinary days could start with something as simple as a bark. The next few days passed in a whirlwind for Tom. Between caring for Zeus, visiting Helen in the hospital, and preparing for the transit company's new campaign, he barely had a moment to catch his breath. Yet despite the chaos, he found himself happier than he'd been in years. Zeus had settled into Tom's small flat with surprising ease, quickly claiming the worn armchair by the window as his favorite spot. The little dog's presence filled a void Tom hadn't even realized was there, bringing life and warmth to the once lonely space. On Friday afternoon, Tom received a call from the hospital. Helen was recovering well and would be discharged the following day. As he hung up the phone, Tom felt a mix of emotions wash over him. He was relieved that Helen was okay, but a part of him also felt a twinge of sadness at the thought of saying goodbye to Zeus. Well, mate, Tom said, turning to the dog who was watching him intently. Looks like you'll be heading home tomorrow. Bet you'll be glad to see your mom, eh? Zeus's tail wagged at the sound of Tom's voice, but there was something in the dog's eyes that made Tom wonder if he understood more than he let on. The next morning, Tom and Zeus made their way to the hospital. As they entered Helen's room, the elderly woman's face lit up with joy. Zeus, she exclaimed, her voice stronger than Tom had expected. The little dog leapt onto the bed, tail wagging furiously as he covered Helen's face with enthusiastic licks. Tom watched the reunion with a smile, though he couldn't quite shake the hollow feeling in his chest. Over the past week, he'd grown more attached to the little terrier than he cared to admit. As Zeus settled into Helen's lap, she turned her attention to Tom. You must be the kind bus driver I've heard so much about, she said, her eyes twinkling. The nurses told me what happened. I can't thank you enough for what you did. Tom felt his cheeks flush. Anyone would have done the same, he mumbled, uncomfortable with the praise. Helen shook her head. Not anyone would have followed a strange dog off their bus, dear. You're a special one, you are. As they chatted, Tom learned more about Helen's life. She'd been a teacher before retiring, and Zeus had been her constant companion for the past 8 years. He was a rescue, you know, she said, scratching behind Zeus's ears. The shelter said he'd been abandoned. Poor thing, but he's been nothing but a blessing to me. The mention of the shelter sparked an idea in Tom's mind. Mrs. Thompson, he began hesitantly. I was wondering, would you mind if I came to visit Zeus sometimes? I've grown quite fond of the little chap. Helen's face softened. Oh, love, of course you can visit. In fact, she paused, seeming to consider something. I volunteer at the local animal shelter a few days a week. Why don't you join us? They're always looking for more help, and I have a feeling you'd be a natural." Tom was taken aback by the offer, him volunteering at an animal shelter. A week ago, he would have laughed at the idea, but now looking at Zeus's expectant face, he found himself nodding. "I'd like that," he said, surprising himself with how much he meant it. As they left the hospital, Zeus trotting happily between them, Tom felt a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced in years. Little did he know that this was just the beginning of a series of events that would test his newfound resolve and change his life in ways he could never have imagined. The following week, Tom found himself standing outside the Liverpool Animal Welfare Society, nervousness fluttering in his stomach. Helen and Zeus stood beside him, offering silent support. "Ready?" Helen asked, a knowing smile on her face. Tom took a deep breath and nodded. As they entered the shelter, the cacophony of barks, meows, and squawks washed over them. The smell of animals and disinfectant filled the air, and for a moment, Tom felt overwhelmed. A young woman with vibrant blue hair approached them, her face lighting up at the sight of Helen. "Mrs. T, so glad to see you back on your feet," she exclaimed, before turning curious eyes to Tom. "And who's this?" "This is Tom," Helen said, patting his arm. "He's the one who helped me during my emergency. He's here to volunteer." The woman's eyes widened in recognition. "Oh, you're the bus driver everyone's been talking about." She stuck out her hand. "I'm Lily, the volunteer coordinator. We're thrilled to have you join us." As Lily led them through the shelter, explaining the various tasks and introducing them to the animals, Tom felt his initial nervousness give way to excitement. There was something deeply satisfying about helping these creatures, each with their own story of hardship and hope. Weeks passed, and Tom fell into a new routine. His mornings were spent driving his usual routes, now with a newfound appreciation for the unexpected turns life could take. His afternoons and weekends were split between visits to Helen and Zeus and his volunteer work at the shelter. It was during one of these volunteer shifts that Tom's world was turned upside down once again. He was cleaning out the dog kennels when Lily burst in, her face pale with worry. "Tom, we need your help," she said, her voice urgent. "There's been a big accident on the M62, a truck carrying dogs from a puppy mill overturned. We're taking in one evening as Tom was locking up the shelter after a late shift. He noticed a sleek black car parked across the street. As he watched, the window rolled down, revealing a man with a hard face and cold eyes. "Mr. Harris," the man called out, his voice sending a chill down Tom's spine. "We need to have a chat about this campaign of yours. It's causing some inconvenience for certain business interests." Tom felt his heart race, but he stood his ground. "I'm not interested in chatting with anyone who puts profit over animal welfare," he said, surprised by the steadiness in his voice. The man's eyes narrowed. "I'd reconsider if I were you, Mr. Harris. Things could get uncomfortable for you and your little animal-loving friends if you persist." Before Tom could respond, the car window rolled up and the vehicle sped away, leaving him standing alone on the darkened street. As the reality of the threat sank in, Tom realized that his simple act of kindness in following Zeus that fateful morning had set in motion events far beyond anything he could have imagined. His mind raced. Should he back down? Go to the police? As fear and uncertainty battled within him, Tom found himself wishing for Zeus's steadfast presence. The little dog had shown such courage in the face of adversity. Could Tom do any less? With trembling hands, Tom pulled out his phone and dialed Helen's number. As it rang, he made a decision. He wouldn't be intimidated. Whatever came next, he would face it head-on, for the sake of the animals who couldn't speak for themselves. Little did Tom know that his resolve was about to be tested in ways he could never have anticipated, and that the true extent of Zeus's impact on his life was only just beginning to unfold. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity and anxiety for Tom. Despite the ominous threat, he threw himself into the campaign against puppy mills with renewed vigor. His face appeared on posters throughout Liverpool, his story shared on local news and social media. From bus driver to animal advocate, the man who followed a dog and found his calling. The headlines read. But as the campaign gained traction, so did the pushback. Tom received anonymous threatening calls, and one morning he awoke to find his bus. Tom knelt down, wrapping his arms around the little dog who had once again come to his rescue. "You brilliant, wonderful boy," he murmured, his voice choked with emotion. In the days that followed, the story of Zeus's second heroic act spread like wildfire. The Puppy Mill bust made national news, with Tom and Zeus becoming the faces of the anti-puppy mill movement. Donations poured into the Liverpool Animal Welfare Society, allowing them to expand their facilities and rescue efforts. As for Tom, he found himself at a crossroads. The transit company, thrilled with the positive publicity, offered him a promotion to management. But as he stood in the Liverpool Animal Welfare Society, surrounded by the animals he had grown to love, he knew his path lay elsewhere. "I am sorry," he told his bewildered supervisor, "but I think I've found my true calling." And so David Harris, once an ordinary bus driver, became the full-time outreach coordinator for the Liverpool Animal Welfare Society. His days were now filled with rescue operations, educational programs, and yes, the occasional media appearance with his four-legged partner, Zeus. 1 year to the day after that fateful morning, when a desperate bark changed his life, Tom stood before a crowd at the grand opening of the city's new state-of-the-art animal shelter. Helen sat in the front row, Zeus on her lap, both beaming with pride. A year ago, Tom began his voice carrying across the gathered crowd. "I was just a bus driver. I thought I knew where my life was headed. But then this little dog," he gestured to Zeus, who perked up at the attention, "showed me that sometimes the most extraordinary journeys begin with the smallest of actions." He paused, looking out at the sea of faces, fellow volunteers, rescued animals in the arms of their new families, community members who had rallied behind their cause. "Zeus taught me that heroism isn't about grand gestures. It's about being willing to listen, to take a chance, to follow your heart, even when it leads you off your planned route. Each of us has the power to make a difference, to be a hero to someone in need, whether they have 2 legs or 4. As applause filled the air, Tom felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over him. His life had been transformed in ways he could never have imagined, all because he chose to listen to a dog's desperate plea for help. Later that evening, as Tom sat in Helen's cozy living room, Zeus curled up contentedly between them. He marveled at the journey that had brought him here, from a solitary existence to being part of this unconventional but loving family, from a spectator in life to an active force for change in his community. "Penny, for your thoughts," Helen asked, a knowing smile on her face. Tom chuckled, reaching down to scratch Zeus's ears. "I was just thinking about how much has changed. A year ago, if someone had told me I'd be where I am now, I'd have thought they were barking mad." Helen laughed, the sound warm and comforting. "Life has a funny way of surprising us, doesn't it? You know, there's an old saying, when the student is ready, the teacher appears. I think Zeus here was your teacher in a way. He saw something in you that you hadn't yet seen in yourself." Tom nodded, feeling a lump form in his throat. "I owe him so much. Both of you, really." "Oh, pish posh," Helen said, waving her hand dismissively. "We all helped each other. That's what family does." Family! The word resonated in Tom's heart. Yes, that's what they had become. An unlikely, wonderful family brought together by extraordinary circumstances. As the evening wore on and Helen regaled him with stories of her teaching days, Tom felt a sense of peace settle over him. He thought back to that morning on the bus, the split-second decision that had changed everything. How close he had come to ignoring Zeus's plea, to staying in his safe, predictable routine. Life, he realized, was a lot like driving a bus. You might start out with a set route in mind, but you never knew when you might need to take an unexpected turn. The key was to remain open to the possibilities, to be willing to veer off course when something or someone important called for your attention. As he prepared to leave for the night, Tom knelt down next to Zeus. The little dog looked up at him, brown eyes wise and loving. "Thank you," Tom whispered, ruffling the soft fur, "for everything." Zeus's tail wagged, and for a moment Tom could have sworn he saw a glimmer of understanding in those expressive eyes. A silent acknowledgement passed between them, 2 unlikely heroes who had found in each other the courage to make a difference. As Tom stepped out into the cool Liverpool night, he felt a sense of excitement for what the future might hold. There would be challenges ahead, no doubt, more animals to save, more battles to fight. But with Zeus by his side and the support of his newfound family and community, Tom knew he was ready to face whatever came his way. After all, sometimes the most extraordinary journeys begin with a simple act of kindness and the bark of a brave little dog. To the end, the story between Tom and Zeus is a testament to the invisible and powerful bond between humans and animals. We may never fully understand their thoughts or emotions, but once we open our hearts, they teach us about loyalty, unconditional love, and courage. Simple yet meaningful acts, like Zeus saving Mrs. Thompson's life, not only change a person's life, but also awakened us to the boundless love they can give. Sometimes love doesn't need to be spoken. It's shown through silent, extraordinary actions like this. If you felt the magic of the bond between humans and animals in this story, don't forget to hit subscribe and stay tuned for more touching stories we'll share. Stories like these can change how we see the world and spark compassion and love within us. Thank you for watching, and make sure to turn on notifications so you won't miss any future videos. See you in the next story.